All right. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, welcome to the ICCT Annual Conference Edition 2024. The ICCT Annual Conference is always a key event for us, and we hope for you, for thinkers and doers to come together and to reflect on key trends that are shaping our field of terrorism and counterterrorism. In the previous years, our annual conferences has covered topics such as great powers rivalry and how that is impacting terrorism and counterterrorism in Europe and around the world. We've also focused last year on anti-institutional, anti-government, anti-system extremism and the rise of right-wing extremism as a new key phenomenon. But this year, what we want to do is to look ahead, to think about what are the key threats that we will be confronted with in the next political cycle, in basically 4 or 5 years from now, and how can we basically anticipate these threats and potentially try to prevent those threats to materialize or to reach a problematic scale. And notably, in the context of this conference today, we will talk, for instance, about artificial intelligence and how it is being used for terrorist purposes, or potentially also could be used in the field of countering terrorism or preventing violent extremism. Those discussions that we will have today, of course, are and will be informed by the current situation. And that current situation, what is it? It is basically materialized by or illustrated by the rising threat, again, of terrorism in Europe, where the threat level is currently elevated, as a lot of you are aware. But it's also a diverse threat, with not only the remaining jihadi threat that is there, that is rising again, notably now focused with the threat from ICCT, but it's also the fast rising threat from right-wing extremism in many countries, or indeed anti-institutional, anti-system extremism that is a growing concern in several European countries. And it's not about any of these threats individually, but it rather is about the combination of all of these threats together that is currently making this threat elevated. And it's not just in Europe that the threat is rising, it's also in North America, in South Asia, or in Africa, which has been described recently as the epicenter of terrorism worldwide. The threat is shaped by a number of trends, and just to highlight a couple here very quickly, of course, technological advance, artificial intelligence already mentioned, the use of drones, 3D printed weapons, all of these are transforming the terrorist threat and the capabilities of terrorist actors. It's also about geopolitics, and that includes notably the return of state-sponsored terrorism, and also growing discussion about state terrorism, that is the use of terrorist tactics and means by state and government, that is also coming back to the agenda. And it is no surprise that we want also to touch on these issues in this very town, which hosts institutions such as the International Criminal Court and the Court of Justice. And all of this is creating a lot of uncertainty, as the title of our conference has it. Except that maybe if the title of this conference is Houston, we have a problem. Maybe there is no Houston to call when it comes to terrorism. And many times it feels, rather than the movie where this quote is taken from, it feels like we're more in this movie, everything, everywhere, all at once. And that is basically more of the feeling that we are currently confronted with. And of course, that's where my knowledge of movies will stop, so I will not bother you with more of movie quotes and titles. But discussions that we are having and will be having today are very much in line with ICCT's mission, which is basically to bring people like yourself here together, or people that are joining online, to build bridges between different communities, thinkers, scholars, academics, but also policymakers and practitioners in this field, so that basically together we can think, we can shape together better, more effective counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism policies and practice that are compliant with human rights and the rule of law, because we believe that is part of effectiveness. And this annual conference is just one piece in this larger effort of ICCT, because we do that by conducting research, by giving policy advice to different governments and agencies in Europe and outside of Europe, to do capacity building exercises, to again strengthen counterterrorism and PCV efforts worldwide, and as well by ensuring proper monitoring and evaluation, as we believe it is important to evaluate the effectiveness of these policies and practice. And on that, we're very proud to have launched very recently the Monitoring and Evaluation Center of Excellence, which has been a long-term objective of ICCT. And we'll say a little bit more later today about the achievements of ICCT, including the launch of the Monitoring and Evaluation Center of Excellence. But so for this conference, and to conclude here, before I give the floor to much more smart people than I am, to this conference and much more, we are very lucky to count on the support of the Dutch NCTV, the Dutch Counterterrorism Fusion Center, and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who have been very generous supporters and very important partners for ICCT. So on this note, I'm very happy now to give the floor to my friend, Mina Noor, who is the head of Division for Counterterrorism and National Security at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mina, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. There's always a slight risk of having the opening words that I can do now after Thomas, who has touched upon the most important challenges that we are all facing in the CT arena. And I'm certainly not one of those experts that Thomas referred to, because those experts are in front of me. But I'm happy to be here with you and to be able to address you with a few opening comments. And thank you, Thomas, for inviting me to share these thoughts with you. And I also would like to congratulate your entire team for gathering us in this room again with an impressive group of experts and practitioners in the field of counterterrorism. I'm amazed always by the ICCT's ability to identify key topics for discussion, as you mentioned. Last year it was on the right-wing extremism and anti-institutionalism. The year before, great power competition, absolute excellent topics for conversations that we were definitely not done about to talking, but certainly it brought our thinking at the ministry further. So now, turning to the challenges today, the terrorist threat comes from various parts of the world, and its effects are very felt everywhere. This means that we have to adapt to it as well. A one-size-fits-all approach will not do in a world where the terrorist threat is increasingly complex, multifaceted, and hybrid. And a regional approach to both PCVE and kinetic CT remains key, but we have to adapt to local needs and to the circumstances and focus on the specific grievances that inform radicalization and extremism. There are a few circumstances that do indeed make it even more complicated and add to that age of uncertainty. Thomas, you mentioned already some of the challenges and I will repeat them because this is what keeps us busy at the ministry. Africa, where we witness the continued surge of jihadi terrorism, along with the growing instability due to several military coups. In the Middle East, although Daesh lost its caliphate, the organization proved capable of carrying out attacks in both Syria and in Iraq. And then there are thousands of jihadis and their families who still remain in custody, either in detention centers or in displacement, some of them unfortunately very young, and some of them unfortunately have nothing to do with the ideologies that some adults chose for before them. These camps are fertile grounds for ISIS and pose an ongoing security and humanitarian threat for all of us. And we must not shy away from having an open discussion on this topic, even though I'm sure you all understand and recognize that it's very complex. And we have to make sure that we don't turn a blind eye to the humanitarian needs and socioeconomic needs of these people in these camps. In Central Asia, ISIS-K underlined its ambition to become Daesh's most deadly offshoot, with terrorist attacks in Afghanistan and its neighboring countries. The latest terror attack in Moscow made clear that ISIS-K is a direct threat to Europe as well. And then, as was mentioned, there was the rise of right-wing extremism and anti-institutional extremism in all its forms across the Western world, including in the Netherlands. And of course, I have yet to mention the ongoing war in Ukraine and the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel and the devastating assault on Gaza that continues to this day. It's too early to truly assess the impact of these wars on the terrorist landscape, but we can surely state that they will have a huge implication for the threat picture in the coming years. And what is already clear is the galvanizing impact of the 7th of October and its aftermath that it has had, primarily on jihadi groups who have tried to use the attacks for their own propaganda, as well as actually also for the right-wing extremists who have contributed to the sharp rise in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, both in online and offline domain. These developments are playing out against the backdrop of the ongoing politicizing of counterterrorism. As mentioned before, the global consensus on how to combat terrorism and how to ensure that human rights are protected while we do so is no longer a given. A significant part of the fight against terrorism will remain focused on kinetic operations, especially in the large parts of Africa and in the Levant, where terrorist groups are physically terrorizing the population. But we must acknowledge that massive infiltration of the online domain by extremists and terrorists and their enthusiastic use of new technology to further their goals is also a huge threat. And unfortunately, governments are often lagging behind. We are lagging behind in our understanding and our use of new tech, in particular in artificial intelligence. Today's terrorists are most resourceful, better connected, and more technologically savvy than before. They're also younger, unfortunately, and come from a wider variety of backgrounds than before. Recruits, especially the young ones, radicalize online in record times, sometimes in a period of just a month. In counterterrorism in particular, online and offline domains are not separate worlds, but heavily interconnected. We see this in recruitment of new members and in the mobilization of autonomous actors who already are present in our societies. We also see the real-world effects of new tech. 3D printers can be bought online for less than 20 euros, and it takes about 2 minutes to download the instructions on how to print your own 3D weapon. Such weapons have already been used for real-world attacks, like in Halle in Germany in 2019. AI was mentioned before. The implications of this technology on CT cannot be overstated. And I'm smiling at colleagues from ICCT who have just a few weeks ago provided at our ministry with some international partners an excellent presentation there. So it was very useful, and it helped us, the public service, to understand a bit better how things work. So the implications of this technology on CT cannot be overstated. Risks of misuse are large and multifaceted, including to bypass existing technology, human-like radicalization and recruitment techniques, and amplifying the spread of terrorist propaganda and dissemination of disinformation. AI is already actively being used by extremist and terrorist groups as well as by state actors, and I expect that its use will increase significantly in the coming years, which is not anything new to none of us here probably. So what are we to do? How do we effectively combat terrorism when the lines between offline and online, real and fake, autonomous actors and state-sponsored terrorism are increasingly blurred? I hope that this conference will help us to get the answers. I certainly don't have the answers, but I can give you in a minute a few of the activities that we are doing as the Netherlands. What is clear is that the terrorists just like the terrorists are fighting, our efforts need to focus as much on the online as offline domain. On one hand, targeted offline PCV interventions are crucial, and they will remain so, which means a regional targeted approach is key. By focusing on root causes, building resilient communities which can equip citizens, especially youngsters, with the tools to recognize and withstand online recruitment. For Western societies, this includes finding ways to engage with the growing group of citizens on all sides of the political spectrum and in all layers of the society who feel unheard by their governments and are turning their backs on society. Also, while we have to step up our online game and educate ourselves in the ways in which new tech is being used by terrorists, new technology also presents us with interesting opportunities in the ways that we combat terrorism, both online and an offline world. This means utilizing the same technologies that terrorists use in order to counter them. Improving AI literacy of terrorism, mid-level and top sector, practitioners, policy officers will be critical to address the forthcoming threat of misuse of new tech. And close cooperation with partners, obviously, including unconventional ones, that's vital. Terrorism has never been contained by national borders, and the developments in the online domain have supercharged this. Cooperation, jointly identifying knowledge gaps, and sharing expertise and information is simply the only way forward. And what does this mean for the Netherlands? Offline, we have worked to ensure that our geographical focus and our PCV interventions are in line with the threat assessments for the Netherlands. Based on this mapping, in the past year, we have rebalanced our diplomatic network of regional and 5 bilateral security advisors where they are needed to ensure that this network remains fit for purpose. One practical result of this exercise is our investment in greater engagement in Central Asia in the past years. In the online domain, the Netherlands government, in line with the European regulations, has launched a new regulatory and policy framework to combat online extremism and terrorist content. This is the so-called enhanced online approach, which combines both a domestic and international approach. A key deliverable in the government's approach is engagement with the internet sector and a critical dialogue with online platforms. This has not been easy, as you can probably imagine, but is the only way forward in a world where the influence of platforms like Meta and X rivals, or even increasingly exceeds that of most governments. That is why the Netherlands urges strongly to keep the terrorist threat emanating from online and cooperation with the tech sector high on the agenda of the international fora like GCTF, EU Internet Forum, and Christchurch Call, and the Global Internet Forum for Counter-Terrorism. For example, 2 weeks ago, we hosted a conference on a constructive dialogue between a group of 22 government representatives and the Global Internet Forum on Counter-Terrorism. This was a first but crucial step towards intensified collaboration and balanced accountability with internet platforms for countering violent extremism and terrorist content online. Dialogue is important, but we still need tools to actually combat terrorist activity. And the recent attacks by Hamas have again underscored how skillful terrorist organizations are in online fundraising. Even though we have made great strides in countering of terrorist financing, we still have ways to go. And this is why the Netherlands has actively promoted sanctions as another mechanism to fight the financing of terrorists and cut that financing as well, and disrupt the financial streams. The Netherlands was one of the initiators of a dedicated European sanctions regime for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And at the same time, we were also the first European country to sanction a right-wing terrorist group, the Base, and we are pushing for this group to be included on the European sanctions list as well at the moment. As you can see, we have not been sitting still. And at the same time, we also realize that there's so much more work to be done, and there's very little what we can do. So all the help is needed, and especially all the expertise is needed. And as Thomas mentioned, we're gathered here from different backgrounds, practitioners, academia, and government representatives is very much needed to actually bring the different perspectives together at the same table. And that's why I'm very excited about today's conference and the opportunity to hear from you and from your specialist and expertise areas. And I hope that you will be able to come up with some thought-provoking discussions. Wishing you a very nice day and a fruitful conversation. Thank you.
So very good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kacper Rękawek. I'm the Senior Fellow and Head of the Emerging Threats Pillar at ICCT. And what a plenary we have for you right now. I'll bring the speakers to the podium, so to speak, and I'll be introducing them. So Jonathan, Hans, Jakub, and Lisbeth, you're here. If you could join us, I'll be introducing you all in a second. So maybe a short introduction from me first as to how we would like to play it. We have an hour and 15 minutes to do this. And in the hour and 15 minutes, we're going to do three things. First, we have given our great speakers an opportunity to actually lay their case in front of us for a few minutes. Then we'll have a bit of a Q&A between us and a discussion. And then obviously the floor is open to you and also the internet side of things as well. So we're going to be taking questions from that side as well. Now, it is a bit provocative in terms of Houston, we have a problem, uncertain age of uncertainty. And obviously we just wanted to make sure that we get you all going in this sense to think about the unthinkable in a way, and drawing on the experience and the expertise of the four people in the room who come to the table from different, let's say, quarters, if you like. And please feel provoked, let's put it this way. We'll try and make sure that we get a good discussion going on the trends and the future of CT, PCVE, whatever term is closer to your heart. So as I said, 1 hour and 15 minutes, we'll try to cover all of this, and let me introduce our speakers. We start with Jonathan Hall, and I hope not to get that wrong, because Jonathan is an independent barrister in London, but he wears two hats, if I know correctly. One is from 2019. You are the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation in the UK, but there's another one, which is also an independent reviewer of the threats to the state threats legislation. So thank you for being here with us, Jonathan, and obviously Jonathan will be looking at the things from his corner, and the legal side of things will be looking up to you to discuss the future trends and the scale of the problem that we might be having. If we go in alphabetical order, Lisbeth van der Heijden, who wears three hats. Okay, the main hat is the municipality doing PCVE in The Hague, so where we are, so that's one. Then there's the other one with Ischa, which is the University of Leiden, for those of you not familiar with the place. And then there's the third hat. You are an associate fellow of ours. So ICCT, so three hats, plenty of experience in the room. Thank you for being here with us. Then we move on to Jakub. Jakub represents the organization which is called the European Values, and Jakub has been in Prague, in Czech Republic. And Jakub has been at the forefront of the, let's say, struggle that we have had with certain not so friendly countries, if I could put it this way, meaning first Russia and now on to China. And Jakub's been doing these things way before everybody else, so he's a bit of ahead of the curve, if you like, on this front. So thank you for being here with us, and obviously we're going to stretch the angle of CT in that direction as well. And last but not least, definitely, Hans-Jakob Schindler, who's here with us, Senior Director, Counter-Extremism Project, but also quite a ton of experience in interesting places, if I could put it this way. Iran, Gaza, UN, right, all in one sentence. Hans, thank you for being here with us. To all of our speakers, many thanks again. Let's stretch the field. Let's think the unthinkable. Let's think about the future, and let's discuss if there is a problem. But the first thing's this. I've asked each of you to think before about this, and let's play it like this. 3 minutes for each of you to tell me, tell us, tell everyone, and also people online, what's the trend in CT, PCVE that you see, that is emerging, that keeps you awake at night, or the trend that you like, maybe, that's going to be hitting us and that we will be discussing in these conferences for years to come. We go in alphabetical order, so I go to Jonathan first.
We all know that President Raisi crashed in a helicopter earlier this month. On Saturday in London, there was a demonstration by some individuals, dissidents, and they were attacked by supporters of the regime in London, and they were injured. Is that transnational repression? Because I can tell you from the perspective of a sort of insider, outsider, I'm an independent person, but I speak to government all the time. That is where the focus of the CT world is moving. It's moving not completely, but away from the lesser, I'm going to say lesser threats, and I want to be provocative about this, of certain types of terrorism to stuff that is done by or on behalf of or for the benefit of states. And the key difficulty in the context of transnational repression is how on earth do you prove that there is a state behind it? And that is going to be the fundamental problem, I think, for dealing with this sort of material, as well as the difficulty of defining it. I'm a lawyer, so I want to see definitions. If there are special laws being passed, I want them to be capable of being judged. I want there to be an ability to prove or disprove. I don't want special powers to come along just because it's a trendy label, which is a risk. Now, what did I mention provocatively about certain counter-terrorism matters being of less weight? What I mean is we're now reaching a position, I think, with young children and neurodiverse young people committing offences, lone actors. It's very difficult, I think, to say that the foundations of states are being shaken by many of what they do. If a young person obsessed by some weird form of extreme right-wing terrorism starts to plot to go and carry a knife and kill a schoolmate, is that fundamentally attacking the state? I mean, that's a question I would raise, but that's what we're looking at the moment in the counter-terrorism field. I wonder whether or not there's some merit in moving a bit towards a model where you say, let's look at national security threats, and actually some of these things that we think about as terrorism aren't so different from knife fights, and they certainly have much less impact on individuals than knife killings in North London, where there are up to hundreds over the years. The second thing I want to mention about, I was going to mention AI, but it sounds like someone else is going to talk about it. But can I just say the internet is just so fundamentally important. 4 hours a day, I think, is what our Ofcom, which is the regulator, is estimating that people are spending on time. It's only going to get worse. As a lawyer, the key question is we can talk about collaborating with tech companies, we can talk about regulatory frameworks, but someone has got to make a decision about what are the priorities and how you define these priorities. In the UK, we have something called the Online Safety Act, and it mandates tech companies to spend most of their time and resources focusing on terrorist offences. So the question about what actually are terrorist offences online is really, really vitally important. My own personal view is that although collaboration is vital, ultimately it's for democratic states, democracies, to start to set some of the standards and start to export some of those to the tech companies despite their First Amendment things. The last thing I'd say, chatbots, really, really hard. If you're a lawyer, how do you prosecute a chatbot? You can't, it's not a person. How do you prosecute someone who's in a dialogue with a chatbot? Well, it's not incitement, because we think about incitement as one person talking to another person. So I would say, from a legal point of view, if we're talking about liability, we have to look at the, dare I say it, the AI life cycle, the role of programmers, the role of trainers, the role of data providers, the roles of disseminators, the roles of APIs. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, Jonathan, I think you've got us covered for the next few years, to be honest with you, but thank you for that. I'm happy that we can now move on to Lisbeth, because obviously Jonathan reviews the legislation that impacts you as someone working in PCVE at the local level, so I'm happy to hear your thoughts on the upcoming trend and how fun it is to work in that line of work.
Well, weirdly enough, it has always been fun, and the more complex it gets, the more challenging in a good way as well. But yeah, when I thought about this, I thought you're probably all familiar with the quote, if it looks like a duck, if it swims like a duck, and if it quacks like a duck. I'm not sure if the quote ends with it is a duck or it probably is a duck, but suffice to say, when it comes to countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism, what we all have seen is when we talk about when it looks like a duck, we never knew what it looked like, what a person should look like, despite some people for some time thinking that a beard or wearing a jalaba would be any kind of indication. It's not. We know that, and we will probably never have a visual picture of what a terrorist looks like. When it comes to swimming like a duck, I'd say that over the past maybe 2 decades, we at the very least established pretty common understanding and a lot of knowledge on what jihadism looked like, including its modus operandi, transnational networks, command control structures, and so on. That has changed with the phenomenon that we're dealing with today when it comes to right-wing extremism, accelerationists, but also when it comes to the sovereign citizen movement. It's much less established what that looks like. And when it comes to the final one, quacking like a duck, I was thinking on the one hand, we have a lot of ducks quacking, and then we have a lot of ducks quacking both offline and online, and it's become much harder to determine, well, in line with what you were saying as well, what is it that they're doing? Is it activism? Is it extremism? If it's extremism, is it violent? Is that determined by any ideology or elements of an ideology, or is that determined by action and behavior? And if it's extremism, is it violent or is it non-violent or not yet violent? That's become very difficult to illustrate. Well, I work at the municipality of The Hague. After October 7th, 80% of my work has become focusing on what goes on in Gaza, in Israel, and how that affects polarization and maybe polarization towards radicalization or not. We still don't know yet, and it's very hard to establish that. In February, we had an event with people with an Eritrean background coming to transnational repression. That's become my job ever since, basically because no one really knew where it belonged at the municipality, because we didn't really have a team to deal with transnational repression, including answering the question, again, is this transnational repression and how do we know? So it's become much more difficult, and then 2 and 3 are interrelated. That's difficult, and there's that online dimension there where I feel, when I used to work at ICT, you write these things saying like our government should step up, we're behind. Right now, after 4 years in practice, I'd say we're way behind. I mean, on the local level, we're still asking around and no one really knows the answer. What are we allowed to do online to begin with? And we keep saying, look, online is as important, if not more important, than offline. It incites things that happen offline. But basically, no one's doing really anything with it because no one knows. It's not that we cannot do stuff online on the local government level. It's more no one starts because no one is sure whether we're allowed to. And then the third and final point to add to that, when it comes to dealing with and what we should be doing, this is about the whole privacy point. So in light of the GDPR regulations, what I'm seeing is that in the wake of jihadism, we established a whole approach in the Netherlands and elsewhere where a lot of information was shared. Too much information often, also because a lot of actors are thinking we don't want to be the one who didn't share information and then something bad happens. Nowadays, from a practitioner perspective, I think the pendulum has swung entirely the other way, where, again, not so much because actors aren't allowed to share information, but much more what I'm seeing is that actors do not know whether they are allowed to share information, and if so, to what extent. And as a result, we have to deal with online. We don't really know who should be dealing with it and what is allowed to be shared. And as a result, I feel that as a field, we're kind of watching it unfold, not really knowing what to do with it.
Okay, so Lisbeth, you're saying the train is kind of leaving the station and we're here.
Yeah.
Now, thankfully, we have Jakub, who's next, who's been kind of ahead of the curve on a couple of issues. So, no pressure on you, Jakub, absolutely, but just tell us what to do, how it looks from your side.
Thank you, and I'll do my 3-minute time clock. I come from Prague. I sit in Central Europe, so let me give you where I think we are. Pretty much of Central Northern Europe is preparing for a possible defensive war with Russia, and that's something what is the core of the thinking, which overlaps into your field, where practically the thinking until recently was war is an effort of any military. But in a context of Russia, what we see Russia doing in Ukraine and Russia preparing to do against Eastern European and Central European nations of NATO, is that the overlaps are very big. Just to give you a couple of practical examples. October 2014, there was a Russian terrorist attack in the Czech Republic organized by Russian state called GRU, Russian Military Intelligence, where basically a team of operatives blew up an ammunition depot, killed 2 Czech citizens, caused immense damage, and it was a huge GRU operation, which similarly played out in Bulgaria. That's what happened. In early March 2022, I can just share, just to give you an understanding how it looked like in the case of Prague, for example. As the Russian attack on Ukraine started, we had hundreds and low thousands of Ukrainian citizens leaving Czech Republic to go into combat into Ukraine. But what was happening at the same time was there was a high level of fears in Prague, for example, that there would be Russian terrorist attack organized by Russian state inside the city of Prague, as for example there were places where there were Ukrainian citizens training with small weapons because they didn't know if they go back to Ukraine and they go to the front line whether they'll get any of the basic trainings over there, whether there'll be time for that. So they were doing it in the Czech Republic, and the fears are what would the Russian illegals be doing to actually cripple that. And it was very real, honestly. There were people, civilians who were going around the city armed because they were expecting this would be happening, because our police expected this to happen. Fortunately, it didn't happen back then. But very practically, what I think on China we could really look into as well. China is really, unfortunately, a strong allied partnership with Russia. And very clearly, what I think, just to give you a list of things which I think we need to be discussing in the future, Chinese illegal so-called police stations, which are basically intelligence gathering stations inside of EU countries. They are used for kidnapping not only Chinese citizens, quite often European citizens from European countries. There is quite a lot of fears how China might actually use their economic dependencies to European countries in 2 particular scenarios, which let me just spell them out quickly. One, if NATO is in a defensive war with Russia in next 1 to 5 years, that's the time scope which our military leaders are looking into. If this happens, what would China be doing during that time to actually sabotage the defenses of mainly Central European nations? And there are so many entry points which China could be using, which unfortunately spill over into our national decision making as well. From electric car, command center of solar panels, things which everybody would consider, oh, this is just civilian thing, nobody should care about, right? But there are so many overlaps to defense preparations that now the wide feeling of the military preparations, at least in Central European countries where I work, is actually starting to cover all of these aspects, because they will actually be quite important for us, unfortunately, in upcoming years. And just to finish up, last thing to mention, the most likely, hopefully not, but the most likely scenario which we might see China do around Taiwan, the Philippines and Japan might be a quarantine around using Chinese Navy and Air Force. And the question is, how in that scenario would actually European countries be hit through economic and technological dependencies, which then spill over into all of our security situations with Russia? So happy to discuss more in the discussion, but I wanted to make it short.
Thank you. It's not getting really optimistic here, around the table. And I don't think it's going to get any more optimistic with Hans, but you're my last hope. Hans, over to you.
Well, no, not really. So, I mean, the good thing is I feel very young, because when I started to study counterterrorism in '96, counterterrorism or terrorism was a niche subject, because, left-wing extremism, terrorism fueled by the Soviet Union was over for the lack of a Soviet Union. And we had Oslo, so, what terrorism? Why would you even study that? And we missed that there's this weird dude in Afghanistan who, did a lot of strange things, talked a lot of long, boring videos in Arabic, and then all of a sudden there were amazing real estate opportunities in southern Manhattan, right? And I feel I have the same arguments again now, right? So a couple of 30,000 feet view on terrorism status right now. So first of all, the model of territorial control has really caught on, right? We have West Africa, 45% of Burkina Faso, 40% of Mali, 20% of Niger, growing numbers out of control of the government and variable between Jinim, ISWAP, or IS Sahel province under control of terrorist organizations. We will have a 50-50 toss-up at the end of 2024, whether Somalia will exist as a country or will be run by Al-Shabaab. And really bad news is, from Afghanistan to West Africa to East Africa, we're very fast running out of countries who actually want to cooperate with us on the kinetic operations on which we should put our emphasis on, but we don't have any military bases left that would allow us to put our emphasis on, and we're getting replaced by the Russians. Now, we just heard, maybe not the most reliable counterterrorism partner that we could have at this particular point. So that's number one. Territorial control is back. Number two, the Palestinian issue is back, something that in particular in Europe we had very comfortably parked in some back room of our diplomatic efforts. There was the Quadriga and the Troika, but I mean, really, we just thought this is something we just don't have to deal with. And it's come back with a vengeance, as it does when you don't take care of an issue, in several ways. Number one, it is exacerbating divisions in our own society. Number two, it actually now develops into an actual concrete terror threat by Palestinian organizations as well. Yes, very much propaganda from Hamas on a daily basis, saying it's about time that you do something in Europe. And as people here in the Netherlands and me in our office in Germany were very well aware of, we had arrested a Hamas cell who was actually looking for an arms dump. That was then subsequently found in Bulgaria, which was done several years ago. So this was always plan B of Hamas. You know, as my colleague Guido Steinberg says, regional terror organizations are only regional until they decide no longer to be. Right? So this is something we have to contend with. On top of all of this, we have a rise of anti-Semitism where really all of the extremism meet in our societies, whether it's the alliance of the extreme left with the Islamists, whether it's the alliance of the right-wing extremists with left-wing extremists, undermining the stability of our society. And here we do have a society problem because it is the door open to everything that you spoke about, right? And you spoke about. The malign actors who are very much watching this. We're just documenting at the moment on how Russian disinformation campaigns react to what's happening on US campuses. Right? So we have that problem. Again, that's something that we neglected a little bit, that it is an undercurrent. We fell victim to a shift in the way things are formulated and thought we somehow moved past anti-Semitism and just came back quite hitting us in the head. All of this would just be tragic if we had significant elections like in Europe or in North America this year. But luckily we don't, so that's my positive point.
Thank you, Hans. So I think one thing's pretty certain. Here you have all the speakers. We probably have a good title for that conference, let's say, because we clearly seem to have a string of problems and challenges and issues that we need to deal with. And I swear to God, I didn't ask the speakers to be that pessimistic, but hey, here we are. Maybe I'll turn to Jonathan now first. So let's do a, internal Q&A, if you like, before turning over to the audience, because I was always under the impression, a bit provocatively, that terrorism is done from below. It's a bunch of people who get together and attack the state, and that's called terrorism. Now, you spoke this magic term, transnational repression, and a couple of people here picked up on it. How do you see this? Who's in the game? How much is this political violence and terrorism, or is this something that we shouldn't be discussing here? Because there might be some people in the audience who would actually think so. It's the jihadis who are terrorism, and then right-wing nutcases, not states. So over to you.
Well, I think that we've all forgotten, haven't we? Dan Byman, who's I think at Washington University, he wrote an excellent book called Deadly Connections, and I recommend it strongly. The point is that the most capable terrorist organizations in the world have traditionally either been funded by or directed by or given facilities by states. We all in the 2010s and 2000s got used to if you like, the replacement model, where one body is saying, look, we want to achieve our own political objective, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and we forgot actually that there are these very capable terrorist organizations. Now what we're seeing, and I suppose this is why I'm quite pleased to be doing my additional role of looking at state threats, is that states coming in two ways. We know that they have been for a long time, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., assisting terrorist organizations, but now they're beginning to mobilize in other ways. It could be instrumentally. It could be like Russia might use the Wagner Group to carry out attacks in Western countries in order to achieve its strategic goals. But it might also be reaching into, I don't particularly like the word, diaspora groups in order to try and undermine social cohesiveness. So I think the state aspect has always been there, but we've forgotten about it a bit.
And you'd be expecting, Jonathan, that it's going to be creeping up,
Well, it's a bit like the internet, isn't it? I mean, we all, I mean, once countries like the UK, for example, our security service in 2018 or 19 decided to look at extreme right-wing terrorism. It found a lot of it. I suspect that now we're looking at state roles, we'll find a lot more of it. Subject to that really, really tricky issue, which is where you have got groups, you mentioned the Eritrea issue, we can't raise false expectations that the whole might of the counter-terrorism power, the security services, are going to be able to deal with these sorts of issues, because you come back to that unknowable problem where you've got two groups within a diaspora. You've got the loyalists and the patriots who say, don't you dare say that nasty thing about President Xi, and you've got the distance from Hong Kong. How do you prove that a foreign state is actually behind it? If that is going to be shown, it will be at the level of intelligence. It will be very difficult to use in legal proceedings or to break or have public debate about it. So I think we need to be careful about not raising false expectations about the role of the state.
As a responder in
Yes.
this case. Jakob, thank you, Jonathan. I want you to chip in here, because obviously you mentioned transnational repression a lot, and you've covered Russian now turning to Chinese. How does it work? Is this our field, or maybe we should park it, in the macro threats, and terrorism is here?
Well, two streams of discussion, I think. One is how Russia uses various tools, including organizing terrorism as an act of state policy. And that's definitely what Russia is doing already. I mean, in Ukraine, that's very obvious now, and even before 2022. In NATO member states as well, we have seen, kidnappings, we have seen assassinations, we have seen explosives being used as effectively tools of terrorism. That's definitely happening, and you might see it even publicly. There's a lot of NATO intelligence basically talking pretty much publicly about what you expect Russia to be doing during an escalation which we expect. Hopefully not a full kinetic war, but definitely even a major escalation against other nations, against NATO nations, not only Ukraine itself. That's one aspect. But the other thing which I'm afraid we are quite often forgetting, and it's really because of silos we have in our policy circles or in our governments as well, the interconnections to China. And that's something what has changed really recently during last 12 months approximately. Because during the first year of the big Russian war since spring 2022, China was not fully backing Russia. It was really hedging and waiting how it ends up. But for last 12 months, and that's the most scary part, honestly, for us sitting in Central Europe, China decided to go fully in financial, material, and technological support of Russia and Russian war machine, which is not only destroying Ukraine and slowly winning, unfortunately, but also preparing for a major conflict against NATO. So why I'm saying it is that when you see all the places in Europe where Chinese intelligence has access to, telecommunication companies, electric cars in the future, TikTok, and most of young generation getting sucked by it in many ways. All of this is Chinese intelligence gathering it. The question is, and obviously I don't have the public answer to it, which portions of all of these huge Chinese intelligence gathering capabilities are now or will be in the future transferred to Russia as Russia prepares to attack, I hope not military-wise, but definitely prepares to attack the Eastern Europeans. And that's the most scary part, which at least in the military establishments in Central Europe is really being discussed. Because the traditional Russian military threat, I mean, that's huge, but that's quite well known. But the Chinese component, meaning Chinese eyes in Europe, means Russian preparation
An
for
upgrade,
action.
you mean? It's like an upgrade for the Russians in
It's a huge upgrade.
Okay, Jakub,
financial
but
and others,
I'll ask
yes.
you this question, because
Yes.
I recently heard this, and also I'd like to draw Hans in on this point. Recently, we had the chance to brief the two working groups on terrorism about Russia and the far right, the book that we published. And the question there was like, yes, we're very worried, but it's not really us, because you don't have Wagner Group yet, as we discussed, Wagner Group yet detonating things inside of Europe. Therefore, we're just going to park it somewhere else. It's not us. Do you see that happening? Maybe Hans first, and then we'll turn to you, Jakub, again.
I mean, do I see the Wagner Group, by the way, partially now renamed Africa Corps?
Africa Corps,
because
which is,
the biggest fascist fighter in Russia couldn't think of a different name for his troops in Africa, right?
Of course,
so
of course.
had to take Rommel's idea to name his group. So no, I don't see that happening right now. But very clearly, there is a very cozy relationship, and if you haven't followed German media, you now have precise sums of money being paid between Russia and our right-wing and left-wing extremist groups, because it really is not an ideological issue here for Russia. It's simply looking at who causes what societal division and how can I exacerbate that division, whether it's online or offline, and whether I agree with the last idea of proto-Trotskyist relationship to the global economy, or whether I want to have an all-white state. I may have some sympathies for the latter point and less for the first point, is not really the reason why I do the support. So I pay money to the AfD while I at the same time finance Rote Hilfe, and I meddle in campus protests in Berlin, at least on the online sphere. All of this happens at the same time because the point is internal weakening. I think the best picture I've ever heard was a couple of years ago on what the long-term Russian strategy is. It's very clear Russia has the GDP of Italy plus X. So not economically, not militarily, are they really truly part of the G7? So there's a big table and then there's a small table for Russia. The only way that Russia can handle the situation is if you saw off the legs of the big table, everyone will be at the small table. And the way you do that is simply by exacerbating existing societal divisions.
But Hans, you're saying that there is a possibility that not so much that they're going to put Wagner onto a terrorist attack in Europe, but there is a possibility that they disrupt so much that someone else might be engaging in political violence and terrorism.
This is not violence prevention network, right, by the Russians. Whoever does the disruption, whether it's in the political field, whether it's through violence, whether it's through demonstration, will get support from their good friends in Kremlin. Right. Because the point is the disruption, not the form of the disruption. So violence is totally fine.
So if it gets to that level, that's fine, right?
I don't see that anyone in
the
Kremlin has
Before we go to you, Jakub, Jonathan, you wanted to chip in?
Yeah, just a point of information. I mean, the first charge under the UK's National Security Act, so it came into force in December, was a Russian sabotage plot involving the Wagner Group. So actually it has happened in the UK. I mean, it's an alleged, but they've been charged, so there's going to be a trial.
Okay, so we have a case. Jakub, over to you, and then we turn to Lisbeth.
There is an important element, and we all think about Europe or NATO countries as a whole, which is good, but we already have Trojan horses inside. And not only politically, but also physically. So basically, if you look to map of Europe, you see a gap, basically, which is led by Hungary, partly Slovakia, and partly Austria in the future, where it's pretty much safe space for Russian intelligence. And we can discuss dozens of cases and happy to go into detail, but because of Schengen, because of border-free zone, we could easily, this is pretty much how Russian intelligence operates. I mean, they have many other ways, but this is an easy entry point which works, not only because of local governments are willing to do it for various reasons, but also the important element is that you have a huge gap in trust between counterintelligence and police agencies of other countries towards them. So this is basically a blind gap because not only sharing knowledge is not happening or happening very in a limited way and only in hard counterterrorism cases, but when there might be a Russian element into it, the hard
so there's a bit of a gray zone. You're saying that this is that we're suffering from it. That
yes, it's I would say the Trojan horse situation is very explicit, and it's not only political talk. It has very direct security implications. And just to give an example, Czech Republic has been a friend of Slovakia forever, but now the official position of the Czech government is that Czech government is not sharing anything sensitive related to Russia with the Slovak government. And same goes with Hungary. And honestly, we are going to get to a similar situation with Austria after the fall elections, almost for sure. So just geographically, if you look into it, it's huge because this is a staging area against Germany mainly, partly Czech Republic as well, partly southern Poland because of the military preparations, but it's huge. And we can do nothing about it because we are in Schengen pretty much.
Sounds great, sounds groovy. Lisbeth, from your position, if I may, because you mentioned a certain attack in October and how it impacts your work. Let's maybe put it on the local side for now. Can you tell us how it impacts your work? Because we all say it. You know, I've repeated this, and I'm also a Central European like Jakub. I don't have anti-Israeli protests on campuses, hardly any pro-Palestinian feeling. Largely, population is kind of like, do we care really? Sorry about that. How does it work from your side? When you see it, how does it impact you?
Well, I think it mainly impacts us, and that's not one of the three trends I mentioned, but I think a trend that we all point towards kind of underneath all of this, that a lot of what we see isn't clearly terrorism, isn't clearly activism, isn't clearly extremism, it's somewhere in between, and you can look at that from the individual's perspective. At the very least, very often it's not so much anymore about, you could say, safety or direct security implications, or if there are direct security implications, maybe on a much smaller scale, you know, the one-person knife attack, but it has much bigger societal consequences, including the fueling by other states. And in a way, you could say, well, maybe that's good, right? If you're a security actor, then at least the security risk has decreased. But I think the underlying trend is that the societal threat, and then the question is, how would you define that threat? In the Netherlands, the intelligence services have published their report on anti-institutional extremism, and they basically call it a threat that's undermining the democratic rule of law, which is a very abstract concept, and it's very hard, and I mean, plenty authors have pointed at it, to describe why that matters. Because it's slow, and you can look the other way and think, you know, we live in this democratic society and things won't go that quickly. And I think I'm using this as a bit of background to say how Gaza and everything impacts on the local level, is that we're continuously now, we cannot escape the question anymore, do we have an opinion on this? And I feel that for quite some time, from a political as well as from a public administrative perspective, it became quite easy to kind of look at countering and preventing violent extremism from almost a technocratic point of view. Like, we have the teams established, we have procedures in play, we have projects, and now all of a sudden this has happened. Plenty of politicians, plenty of public administrators do not want to comment because they do not want to be dragged into one camp or the other. If they don't mind, they're often at the political fringes, and then they do it sometimes for solely political purposes. But we see that especially very young populations in the city, and we hear that from colleagues across Europe as well, are taking this very personal, and there is a large space for them. Sound is off, but large space for them to be radicalized by it. On a very personal level, we have a lot of countering or preventing extremism projects in the city. It means that the organizations doing those projects, who are quite well versed in how do you deal with conspiracy thinking and so on, they came back to us saying, we don't even know what to do anymore. And I visited some of the school classes, for example, and well, you stand in front of a 17-year-old who basically says, what happened on October 7th? Nothing happened on October 7th. It's all a hoax. Look, and shows you some videos on TikTok. And there you see, again, what I mentioned about being caught up by technological, I mean...
So, Lisbeth, maybe let me ask you this, because you said, okay, we're lacking this, or we're not thinking about this. For you, as an officer working on this at the municipal level, but also knowing about the national and knowing about the international, and I know you do because you've been at this game for quite some time. What would you need to be a bit more optimistic in a setting like this one? Of course, if I can drag you into that discussion.
I feel here what we would need is more political courage and more courage on the public administrative level to speak out. Because I feel like we're getting dragged into much more of a normative debate, and actually citizens demand that almost of their politicians to, whether it's acknowledging feelings or acknowledging what is happening and daring to take a stand or daring to express an opinion. For example, I work for the mayor of The Hague. As long as he doesn't say, I feel this way or I feel that way when it comes to Gaza or Palestine, and that's very contentious to do something, and I feel very difficult to balance all the different interests. Right now, I feel like we're all trying to play all the different playing fields, meaning on the one hand, one week I'll be having a meeting with the mayor and Muslim organizations who are saying, help us out. Yeah. And the next week we're meeting with Jewish students organizations who are saying we don't feel safe at school. And now it's like we're behind the scenes saying, okay, we're doing everything we can, hoping that things will blow over, basically. Hoping that somehow things will de-escalate. And that, frankly, will not cut it.
Fair enough. So I'll turn to Hans now. Jakub, I'll get back to you in a second. Because as much as Lisbeth is working on the local, you, for quite a few years, you were in the global, in the thick of it at the UN. And we're having discussions on so many issues that are, of course, impacting us, but they're not 100% here. You know, we're discussing a conflict that it's kind of like outside our borders, but of course it impacts us. Conflict A, B, or C, situation A, B, C, or D. You know, I'm just mindful of an example. My Australian colleague remembers that Australian police was very unhappy about the Croat versus Serb violence in the 1970s. And they clearly didn't know what the heck was happening. And this was essentially Croat separatists attacking Yugoslav missions, you know, cultural institutes and stuff like that. You know, I'm just wondering, to what extent are we in this situation here in Europe, and how it looked from your point of view, vantage point at the UN, when all these discussions should coalesce? You know, how is that impacting the field?
Well, I mean, I'm too young for once, but I'm told from my colleagues who work at the UN longer than me, we're not really in such an unusual situation. Yes, of course, we have a pretty dysfunctional Security Council. It's just because we unlearned that for the first couple of decades, we had a Soviet Union opposing the US in the Security Council. And that wasn't exactly much more functional than it is now. So yes, things can still be done, but the only problem is they can only be done on an extremely technical level. Politics in the Security Council seeps into everything, including counterterrorism discussions, which were admittedly the last ones to fall. Everything else went much, much earlier. It's really been this year where it starts to be tremendously difficult to get anything done. Hence, the growing terrorism threat in Africa and South Asia, and exactly zero Security Council resolutions. So it does require, and I always say, it's not up to the P5 alone what happens on the UN level. We have 10 non-permanent members who, in coalitions of the willing, can move the needle and can move the needle quite substantially. But we've relegated this in the last decade and a half to the P5, and very little has been done by the non-permanent members. And that's where Europe should step up. I mean, we do have a couple of permanent members, and then usually one or two additional non-permanent members. There is a coalition of the willing to be had there to get through the Council important things, especially recognizing that the UN has a role to play. In all of these areas, whether it's Sudan, whether it's West Africa, whether it's East Africa, whether it's Iraq, the UN has been asked to leave. And that important arbiter, as dysfunctioning, as ineffective or wasteful of money it is, there's simply no one else who can do this. And obviously, clearly, Russia's plan is to replace the UN, not just the Europeans in these conflict areas, and that's certainly not in our interest. So there needs to be some reversal, but one is very comfortable in the thought that this is too dysfunctional in New York for us to even invest some political capital in.
To work through it, right, in this sense. Thank you, Hans. Jakub, you wanted to chip in.
There's also one critical aspect which I'm not sure is so much familiar in the CT field, but I work in a field of China policy, so you might think why I'm actually here. But let me just share one practical thing which might be relevant here in the future. We do a lot of policy simulation. So what exactly can China do around Taiwan? Again, you will ask, why should we care about counterterrorism in Europe?
Precisely.
So the question, in most of the simulations which we run, and those are unclassified, so I can speak about it in detail, the US team, played by various players, always comes with an ultimatum to Europeans and says, you'll be with us against China in helping Taiwan, or, and here is our ultimatum. And the European team always starts realizing where in all of the areas continental Europeans are dependent on American assistance. Obviously, one is the military help in Central Europe through NATO. That's really where I care about because where I sit in. Second, energy and economic issues, so quite wide. But third is intelligence sharing. And much of it, and you know it better than I do, in the CT field, much of it in Europe relies on the NSA signals intelligence work. And usually, in our simulations, which we do around Taiwan and China scenarios, the US team comes back because they know what the Europeans want. And they will be saying to the Europeans, okay, you are not going to be our friend on Taiwan and China, so forget about intelligence sharing because you are not a reliable ally. And there comes usually the police chiefs or intelligence chiefs of those European countries pressuring their political leaders, guys, if we lose our eyes, we are screwed. Sorry for my language. But this is pretty much what usually in those simulations is played out.
So you're saying that this would be the exact result of the US
I don't know
disengagement?
if it would. I hope
potentially.
Not. But definitely when we do these simulations with Europeans and Americans at the table around Taiwan-China scenarios, this usually comes back to that. when Europeans have, let's say, when US has leverage over Europeans and wants to and would be pressuring Europe to actually help US against China in Taiwan.
Okay, so let's tackle this. Thank you, Jakub, because obviously this is an elephant in the room. We're all European here, the five of us here discussing the issues, and obviously Jakub raised the point that US, well, Hans, you mentioned that, of course, there are no elections in the United States, so we don't need to worry about anything. I guess I'll look to you, Jonathan, because obviously you're from a country that has a special relationship with the US, also, I guess, in the CT field, but not only. How does it look from where you sit and from your angle, that if there is disengagement about which me and Jakub worry every night, that the American cavalry on the hill disappears militarily, is this a worry for you that in CT field would that impact us that much? After, of course,
I think the truth is that for the UK, the relations between the intelligence agency in the UK and the American is so deeply integrated that it's not being discussed on that. I mean, there are broader geopolitical things. The concern that unless there is alignment on China, then Russia will lose interest in Ukraine. But I mean, those are bigger things, not really to do with CT.
Okay, so I mean, you don't lose sleep at night because of this.
Not on that. And I should just say, in the UK, just thinking about a bit of good news.
Super, finally.
Good news. There was a terrorist murder in October 2023. There will be good news there.
There will be good news.
It's coming down the tracks.
Bear with us.
Yes.
Commercial break now.
Yes, I agree. Okay, you're right. I need to screw you. And then the previous terrorist murder, was October 2021. Yeah, I know. I've really started this badly, haven't I? Okay. Can I rewind?
So again,
this is very bad news, but there's a glimmer of good in it. And
right. So you're saying that there isn't that much of it, Jonathan?
I am going to say that. Certainly from a UK perspective, in 2017 it was horrendous. There was the Manchester Arena attack, there was Westminster Bridge attack, there was London Bridge. It was awful. If you look at the statistics, the amount of counter-terrorism powers being used was through the roof, and there were so many victims as well. And that has come down. Now, there's never any good news. The lady at the front is telling me there's no good news about terrorist murders, I agree. But the rate has gone down quite a lot.
Okay,
so
we'll take some optimism from that. Lisbeth, over to you.
Yeah, maybe also to ask a question about this, because I remember the last time Trump was elected. Back then I was still working at ICCT, and we had our CVE programs in West Africa, including in Mali, funded by the US State Department. So we were also kind of saying, are we going to ask, what are we going to do? Because this all started under Obama, and now we have a different president with clearly very different interests. I remember we were discussing what we called the bullshit bingo, as in, if you write project proposals, you have certain terminology that you use because you know donors want to hear it. And we thought maybe that's just going to change. So rather than preventing violent extremism in prison, it's going to go to kinetic warfare in West Africa, whatnot. And I remember we sat down with the American ambassador in Mali, and he said, well, Trump is just interested in the war on drugs, so we pretty much try to do the same thing, just under a different, kind of also related to that. And of course, program funding kind of went longer. I've always found it, I mean, we have a different system here in the Netherlands, of course, but a pretty comforting idea that bureaucratics and, bureaucracies move slow, departments move slow, and takes quite a strong hand and a long time to actually shift that.
Yeah, I mean, plus you had, thank you, Elizabeth, because there were examples that, for example, when President Trump got elected, he was against countering disinformation in the US, but it didn't stop the GEC, the Global Engagement Center, to fund multi-million-dollar projects on disinformation, for example, in Central Europe. Yep. So one hand of the government was saying no, the other hand was actually handing out money. But before we turn to the audience, I mean, we need to drag this discussion to the familiar field of the jihadis. I mean, we have to. Because obviously this is the realm in which we all feel comfortable. This is the threat that we have known, that's been with us for decades. Let's play this. Hans, I'll look to you. And the acronym ISKP was mentioned here. And obviously, where we sit here in Europe, is this how much of a concern it is? Because I remember, when you go to conferences around Europe after the pandemic, inverted commas, there is this drumbeat of, yeah, they're coming. Are they coming?
Well, I mean,
They're coming back. meaning,
Shockingly, Afghanistan is under the management of the Taliban, and we have an international terrorist problem coming out of Afghanistan. Who would have ever expected that to happen? I can talk for the German experience, right? I've never seen a more regular drumbeat of arrests of terror cells from one particular terror organization within the span of 8 months than I've seen the last 8 months. So the question is not, are they coming? The question is, who are they that they're already here, and can we discover all of them in time for the Euro to start in Germany, right? That's the challenge right now. It's been very clear that October 7 not only changed all of the other dynamics, it also put enormous amount of pressure on the Islamic State as well as Al-Qaeda, and you can really see that shift in their propaganda. My organization is monitoring that on a daily basis, to do something to get back on the news cycle. Terrorism is fantastic, but totally useless if no one talks about it. And having Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis dominating the news agenda for 6 months on end is a disaster. When at the same time you are about to conquer half of West Africa and no one cares, or you're about to take over Somalia and really no one cares. And in Afghanistan we tell each other it's a faraway country with weird people, and if anything the Taliban may be counter-terrorism partners when half of ISKP is actually ex-Taliban with a growing percentage number of the group. So that means we do have a real attempt here by IS to pull something off. The last journal a couple of weeks ago told us where the preferred options would be. So Munich, Dortmund, and Berlin. This should be their last goal. Please donate something in Monero. Here's our wallet. We do have the last arrest of an ISL 10 days ago in Germany. So there is something that has shifted. Also, it has shifted from an absolute emphasis on lone actors. So I just pump propaganda and someone somehow, somewhat going to do something.
Towards organized plots?
To more organized plots. So, Kerman was the beginning. Moscow, partially due to the inept behavior of the Russians, was number 2. There were a couple of cells that we arrested who were close to do something similar in Germany in the last couple of months. So we have this more classic Al-Qaeda methodology of individuals being recruited and trained outside and then traveling to the target area to conduct
So Hans, maybe let me stop you there. Lisbeth, do you see that? Like in your municipal work, do you, I'm not saying operational comment, but like, do you see this, that the pot is kind of, the water is boiling and it's kind of being a bit unsettled in this sense where you are?
Well, it's a tough question. Yes and no, I would say, because on the one hand, we always write a report for the city council annually, and we've been saying for the past 10 years, jihadism is still the biggest threat. Jihadism is still the biggest threat. It's still the largest number of people in our personalized radicalization approach. It's still the largest number of signals that we're getting as well. At the same time, when you talk about ISKP and the plots, the type of plots that have been foiled also in the Netherlands and the neighboring countries, that is much more in the before sphere. We paid a lot of attention. We tried to set up a lot related to refugee streams, because clearly a lot of refugees coming from the Caucasus region as well meant that it's important to make sure that your signaling network is up to that job. And I don't think we can say yet that it is. But we haven't had any specific cases related to ISKP. And we also haven't seen, for example, that what you sometimes do see very clearly in your local jihadi networks, that it reverberates or related to it, it comes back in conversations or in monitoring by the police, for example.
Okay. Let me stop you there, guys. I'll turn to the audience. So time for the questions from the audience or maybe also from the internet domain. If anyone has a question, I know there'll be a traveling microphone. So we have some time for our discussions. We're not yet thanking you with a round of applause. Allow me to do that later. If there's anyone who would like to ask a question to any of the 4 speakers, please go ahead, raise your hand, and we'll take it. We'll take it from there. I'm also looking at Merlina to check if we have questions on the internet side. If no questions, we can continue. Oh, there is one. Aaron, can you? Yeah, so microphone's coming your way. Please tell us who you are and...
Hello, good afternoon. Does it actually work?
kind of,
Yeah,
yeah.
excellent. Good afternoon. My name is Alexander Jones. I'm with the police in The Hague. At the risk of making this even worse, you've been trying very hard, but I think I can do better than that.
Go for it. I love the Dutch directness. This is always...
Well, I think I found my match in Mr. Schindler. I've been an analyst with the police for nearly 20 years, and a major part of that was involved with serious and organized crime. One of the things that bother me in counter-terrorism is our extreme stovepiping, our silos. We're entirely focused on counter-extremism and all shades of extremism. We're talking about state actors here, so our focus is already shifting. My major concern in the past few years has been the convergence between organized crime groups and all sorts of terrorism, and I'd dearly like to hear from our panel to reflect on convergence between organized crime and terrorism.
Super, thank you for the question. We'll move on to another ones in a second. So I guess the question is, Hans, for you first, but I guess then to everyone.
You know our reports.
Yeah, exactly.
So, this is really still a policy statistical conceptual problem to actually talk about this. Because if you look at the statistics, there is no convergence, right? Because you have a political violence statistic and you have an organized crime statistic, and there is no statistic that tells you on the crossover. We did a quite in-depth study on that problem for the German Foreign Ministry on the convergence between organized crime and right-wing extremists, violence-oriented right-wing extremists around Europe. And in some countries, we couldn't, we just stopped counting because there's so much. Crossover in the membership, crossover in recruiting, crossover in money laundering activities, drug dealing by right-wing extremists, motorcycle, biker gangs, including with very diverse backgrounds, right? Still having a overlap with right-wing, really hardcore right-wing extremist groups, like Hammerskins and Hells Angels. My colleague Alexander Ritzmann in this part of the discussion always puts a picture of a German right-wing extremist on the wall who has 6 different tattoos. 3 of them are organized crime groups and 3 of them are the right-wing extremist groups that he was a member over the years, right? So it is a growing problem. And I see Matthew is going to speak tomorrow, but Hezbollah and drugs transporting and money laundering activities in Europe is one of the key aspects that Hezbollah is doing business. So there is a growing convergence. However, politically, and when it comes to adjudicating all of this, we have a problem that you're either going to have to decide, is this now a terrorism case and I'm going to prosecute it on a terrorist side, possibly not even getting a good result, or do I go the easy route and I go down the organized crime route and I prosecute the drug dealing and I prosecute the money laundering, I get a fairly good conviction. However, I don't understand that although this is a small drug dealing gang, its impact on societal safety is much larger because it is an ideologically informed group. Right? That's why when we had the Turonen, one of the biggest concert organizers in the right-wing extremist scene in the German-speaking European countries, being prosecuted for drug dealing, and I'm quoting the judge, the defendants were given a second chance. They had 36 convictions between the 9 of them beforehand, but the second chance, of course, related to this particular case, where they were adjudicated simply as drug dealers. And as drug dealers, that was the first time they ever done that. 20 years of organizing concerts, abject violence by these individuals, the network between Germany, Austria, Switzerland that these guys maintained before they did this sideline drug dealing and illegal prostitution work, yes. Right? None of this was part of the case. None of the network was disrupted. They got suspended sentences. One went to prison for 2 years, and that was it. And then the network functioned the day after they left the court, right? So yes, they're no longer dealing with drugs. Yes, they're no longer illegally trying to import women to prostitute them for money laundering purposes in the 2 brothels they were running to launder the drug money. That's done. But they're still organizing concerts and they're still having the international contacts. And so that's where the conceptual problem is with this issue, is that it's important to understand that you have a much bigger toolbox on how to disrupt the network. But in order to make that effective, you need to get the political understanding, conceptual understanding of the leadership that this is an opportunity to disrupt the extremism stuff, not hunting some small-scale regional drug dealer dudes that, compared to Drangheta, are really children as far as the amounts they're dealing with is concerned.
Okay, thank you, Hans. I'll bring in Jonathan on this point, because we're touching upon your area of expertise very much. So
Yeah, I mean, I think in the UK, it was the dog that didn't bark to some extent. So the fear has always been, in the UK, the terrorists would get hold of firearms. The UK has a good regime for bearing down on firearms. They're not readily available. So the fear has always been that jihadis, for example, or extreme right-wing terrorists would use OCG, organised crime group contacts, to get hold of these weapons. I think it hasn't happened, and some evidence of that is the obsession by the extreme right-wing in the UK of printing firearms, because they find it very hard to actually get hold of them. One of the posited reasons why that may have been the case is that organised crime groups are really in it for the money, and the last thing they need is the extra attention from counter-terrorism police. The UK, I think, believes truly that it has quite sophisticated counter-terrorism structures, and so that extra attention would not really be welcome from it. I think it may change now in relation to the state threats position. If you think about, again, speaking about the UK, not now part of Schengen, it's harder for Russian intelligence officers to operate, and so the use of proxies may be greater, and therefore there may be a greater need to reach out to organised crime groups to carry out acts like sabotage.
so that the dog can bark. Lisbeth, does the dog bark in the Netherlands?
Well, I would say the police knows that better than I do. What I do know is that there's a lot of attention for it within the Dutch prison system, because there we have seen cases where that happens. It's interesting. We have a concentration model in the Netherlands where we have 3 terrorism wings within the larger prison system, with the idea that at the very least you prevent the regular, you could say, criminal group of detainees from being radicalized. However, on the one hand, we've concluded, and with we, I mean policy practitioners, academics, that at the very least that isn't helping the radicalized detainees to become less radical, to the contrary, I would say. And on the other hand, there's been a study into, does this actually prevent radicalization outside of the terrorism wings? And the answer is, well, to an extent, of course, always that type of answer.
Yes
but
and no.
yeah, but we started kind of differentiating the current regime where people at the very least can be released earlier towards the regular prison system, and there we do see instances of mixing when it comes to sharing strategies, modus operandi, including also access to weapons. When it comes to actual cases, we've had a case of a right-wing extremist who was arrested, and the prosecutor who was present always says, oh, we knew there were weapons, but when we actually entered the house, we ourselves were quite surprised to just see, I think, 7 firearms total. And again, a guy who had a very clear right-wing extremist ideology, but hard to establish beforehand how big of a threat he really was. And in a way, because he was arrested and detained, hard to say what that would have ever been. But yeah, here in the Netherlands, we started expanding our networks, our informal networks in the city towards the shooting ranges, for example. And we were thinking of contacting airsoft
enthusiasts, if
yeah.
I could put it this way. Right. Jakub, well, thank you, Lisbeth.
Just brief insight from Central Europe. So given the Russia scenarios we all discussed there, is that there have been a few actions taken by the national establishment. So, for example, the Czech government put together a law which bans paramilitary groups. Effectively, if you are arming yourself in a group of people with political motivations, this is illegal already. I know it sounds hard, but this was really a hard preventative measure driven by the Czech Defense Ministry, because the fears were that these groups already were cultivated by Russian intelligence. That's confirmed many times, and the scope of it was actually rising. We have, I mean, Slovakia, Serbia, Hungary. That's very visible there. In the Czech context, it was kind of killed very early on, a couple of years ago. The second thing which is ongoing is actually widening the espionage legislation, because in many countries in Central Europe, espionage by law means stealing classified intelligence or classified information and handing it over to a foreign intelligence officer, which is honestly very narrow. So the feeling or the effort is something what the Baltic nations already did in recent years, is to expand that definition into knowingly working for a foreign intelligence agency. And doesn't need to be handed over to a specific officer, could be to a proxy, and there are various ways how to do it. So this is one of the attempts which is being discussed in Czech Republic. The third thing which we have an issue as any post-communist country is the use of intelligence gathered by intelligence community in court. Because given our history, we have in the 90s, everybody except of Poland pretty much divided the police agencies to counterintelligence agencies because of the misuse in the communist era. Which made sense in the 90s and for good reasons. But now we are in a situation where pretty much in many cases the counterintelligence community gathers the surveillance of something, but then it cannot be used in court until they have to hand it over to the police agency, which has to collect the same evidence with the very same legal permit by a judge, but the police has to do it so that it can go to the court. So very practically, it's almost none of it is being prosecuted in court. So the Intel community needs to find ways how to get around it, and it's very tough to do.
Okay, so some optimism, some pessimism. I already imagined the headlines in The Guardian: Estonia bans spies, Czech Republic bans gun enthusiasts. Jakub, you're not selling our region to the audience here, but
we are defending ourselves at least.
You should do better.
Yeah.
Okay. Any further questions, ladies and gentlemen? Because, we've got one question and the second here. So the gentleman on this side first, Aaron. Yes. No. The gentleman who stood up, Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Giordano Segneri. I work at UNDP, a regional hub for Arab states based in Amman. Thank you very much. The conversation is so interesting and so rich and so optimistic. Well, not at all. I have two questions. The first one, is a reflection and a question, because coming from the Levant, where I'm based, and working on issues of peace building and governance, what I've been saying is really striking and very much in line with our analysis. So basically, this region has gone through social and political transformation in the last decade or so, for a broken social contract that communities have tried to reimagine, but unsuccessfully so far. We know that the sensitivity of the Palestinian cause is something very felt across the region. Now with the war in Gaza and West Bank, this is very much new on the table and might also impact the way the social contract is going to be reimagined or rebuilt. Why and how? The governments in the Arab states are navigating a fine line between real politics in terms of alliances, neutrality, and the need to have a public discourse that might be slightly different. Populations are looking at that, are following closely, and the way the political agreement will be reached might actually have an impact on how societies will actually maintain their social fabric, and might also be tempted, some fringes of the society, to also follow extremism or extremist views. Because the second element I wanted to bring is the fact that in Syria and Iraq, while there has been, while ISIL has lost territory, actually we know that cells are still active. They carry out attacks, especially in certain areas in the Syrian desert. And so they might be trying to revamp and reconquer some of the power they had in the last few years. At the same time, the US have been thinking of possibly withdrawing troops from both Iraq and Syria. And in Syria, we know the focus has been very much on counter-terrorism. So there are elements that might, that I fear might lead in a very pessimistic scenario to a revamping of these terrorist entities in the region, given the political spectrum of
And you would
outcomes.
like the panel to comment on that, sir?
If they have any quick reflection on that.
Super.
And the second is very direct question to Jakub.
Please make it very direct.
Very direct, sorry. You mentioned that the scenario, the NATO is studying a scenario of possible defensive war against
NATO
Russia.
experts, NATO as well, but I don't speak on their behalf for sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Just wondering whether there is a more optimistic scenario beyond the zero-sum gain of escalation.
With
Fair
Russia,
enough.
right?
Yes.
Okay, so zero-sum game. Maybe before we go to these 2 points, there was a question on this side. Ronke, did you see the gentleman? Two questions. So BB first, and then...
No, please, go ahead.
Make a decision. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. My name's Kybrand Jacobson from the Department of Peace Operations. We were asked at the beginning to think the unthinkable. And I'd like to invite us to perhaps make an effort or take some steps towards doing that. I think the fundament of much of what we've discussed and the framing of it isn't significantly changed from how we've discussed these issues over the last 20 to 30 years. And that's something that concerns me to a significant extent. I wonder if we run the risk of being too myopic and perhaps missing completely what could be important orientations and solutions to what we're discussing. Over the last 20 years, we've had the largest kinetic operations in recent history. We saw how significantly they failed. I engaged extensively with interviews with ISIS in Iraq in 2010 through 2014. Speaking with US military and intelligence at the time, they recognized that their operations on the ground in Iraq were the #1 driver of recruitment towards ISIS. Our solutions were the very measures which were contributing to worsening the problems. At the Black Sea Security Conference in 2017, much of what was being discussed was presented in the basic framing. And one of the points that was raised that was very interesting is you could go to Moscow and hear the exact same conference in reverse. You could go to Beijing and hear the exact same conference in reverse. Throughout most of the last 15 years, the largest supporter of transnational repression across Africa was Blackwater, not Russian agencies. When we were doing it, it was something that was considered normal, supported by embassies. When it's being done by those we critique and see as opponents, it's something that we draw attention to. Fighters in Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria, when we were engaging with them from 2015 to 2019, one of the points that they were raising was police were killing far more, and Nigerian military operations with our support were killing far more civilians. And one of the major drivers of recruitment to Boko Haram was in response to the violent action and agency that we were supporting.
I would urge you, sir, to go towards
Last
a question.
bit, just very briefly, and thank you.
If you could allow me to point you towards a question.
I will. Just one other point. When we're speaking about, for example, Russian manipulation of the demonstrations on the US campuses, or we're looking at the demonstrations on the campuses themselves, what about highlighting what they're demonstrating in relation to? And what I would suggest is we have evidence-based, proven measures and instruments for addressing the underlying drivers and causes of much of the challenges we're facing. We've seen a doubling of war in the last 10 years, in large part in response to the measures and paradigms that we are engaging with here, while we've seen a dramatic reduction in efforts to address the actual underlying drivers and causes of these issues. It's not easy, it's profoundly challenging, but it hasn't yet been part of the discussion. Thank
Okay,
you.
I guess that was a question. Thank you, sir. BB, over to you.
Actually, I forfeit my question. Most of it was already covered by the gentleman here. So.
Right, okay, so we have a couple of points here. Maybe the 2 points on Syria, Iraq, ISIS reconstituting itself from the gentleman here. NATO escalation, that's going to be for Jakub, but Syria, Iraq, ISIS reconstituting, that's for anyone who wants to pick it up, probably Hans. And then we have the very pessimistic scenario that, even more pessimistic, that essentially this conference was when 2017 in Russia. That's a harsh one, but thank you, sir. If you could respond to that, that would also be a nice way of rounding it up. So maybe start with the easy one: ISIS, Syria, Iraq.
So our failure in the kinetic operations and us being at fault. Funnily, we are no longer in West Africa and terrorism grows. We are not in East Africa, terrorism grows. We're not in Afghanistan, terrorism grows. So somehow the narrative, we caused this, I find really hard to believe, right? What we did was a conceptual mistake. We confused counterterrorism and stabilization operations. I always say we ran out of political will in Afghanistan and prior to that the Americans in Iraq because we went in with a counterterrorism mindset, right? Kinetic operations, and then we forgot that that means we leave, right? Mowing the grass is, I think, the technical term for that. And we got dragged into a stabilization operation without the mindset of a stabilization operation. A stabilization operation is in Kosovo. Anyone still aware that the German military is still operating in Kosovo? Since 1999, right? No one talks about it because it's a stabilization operation. Everyone understands it's not going to be over in 10 years or 20 years, or that there is not a war to be won in Kosovo. It's a long-term effort to build a viable political society. However, if you go into Iraq, right, with a small footprint, because it's cheaper, it's cooler, and if you go into Afghanistan and you think you're going to be gone, and I was part of the planning processes in 6 weeks, right, then you're not bringing the mindset, the capabilities, and the political will there now, to stay longer than, you know, I'm surprised we made it to 2 decades in Afghanistan, right? When we should have been there for two generations because we had 2 generations of Afghans being involved in war. And we assume this is going to be over in 20 years, half a generation. So that was the conceptual mistake. Not that kinetics didn't work, it worked perfectly. Al-Qaeda was done after 6 weeks, right, in Afghanistan. But then the follow-up was a disaster. So it's not the kinetic operation or us being at fault because we're using kinetic operations. Terrorism is perfectly fine to grow without us being involved or us doing any kinetic operations. It's the mindset in which we've done these things where the fault lies.
Okay, so mindset. Lisbeth, over to you.
Yeah, 3 things also to that. I do agree with you that it's kind of a myopic view, you could say, whereas first of all, if we're quoting books and authors, Steven Pinker with his Better Angels of Our Nature, basically arguing, right, the world has only become a safer place when you look at the risk of violence. And I think I already made the point that, in a way, you could say terrorism has been on the decline for a long time, even though we all know you can never actually defeat ideologies long term. So that will never happen. But I do think the risk of the security risk have become much smaller. And then I can't say that about the world at large, but at the very least here in the Netherlands and in the city of The Hague. At the same time, I think we see a lot more in that polarization field, which can go towards extremism for the same types of reasons that also in other countries, you know, the root factors, whatever you want to call them. And I think the reason or the risks that we have now are much more the societal breakdown and much more the exploitation of it. And again, the caution or the fear of addressing those issues head on because it demands political will to do so. And it demands something of agencies to say we're going to focus on having those discussions, talking it out. I mean, we do know a lot about prevention, but that also demands choices.
So
and
it comes
I think
back
that's
to political,
become
Lisbeth,
yeah. So I think
mentioned.
I agree with you, and at the same time, I think the pessimistic view that I still have is that it's very difficult to move towards making the choice to do that on the local level as well as on the national level.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Before we turn to Jakob, Jonathan, last words from you on the...
Just to say, I agree with Lisbeth. It's important not to overstate the problem. I think that everyone working in the counter-terrorism field has an obligation not to frighten populations because fundamentally terrorism is a psychological game. It's about undermining and thinking about the wider state threats area. One of the key objectives for adversaries is to undermine confidence in institutions. So as opposed to throwing everything out and starting again and completely reimagining, I think that incremental change is better. I think that populations, I mean, take the UK, we've had quite a stable terrorism legislation for the last 20 years. It's threat neutral. It doesn't go against jihadis. It doesn't go against right wing. It's available for anyone. In that nice sense.
Again, optimism.
Another optimistic sense.
That you don't have a written constitution.
And we don't. That's yeah, that's true. Well, you're welcome to join us. But I think that incrementally changing, allowing populations to understand, take you with them, rather than tearing everything up and starting again, is not a bad idea. Because I think fundamentally, I agree with you guys. I think that terrorism has been borne down upon, and so I wouldn't overstate the problem.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And Jakub, over to you on the escalation ladder. Are we on an escalation ladder?
I mean, the Russians are, and the Chinese are, and we are really trying to save ourselves, honestly. So, very practically, where we are, what the Russian ideal plan is that Ukraine slowly loses. There is a panic among the Ukrainian population that there would be one, that the front is collapsing. There is approximately 5 to 10 million Ukrainian refugees or IDPs internally in Ukraine who are ready to run away, because they are obviously really fearing for life. If this happens, Slovakia, Hungary will close their borders, pretend it's not their problem, so they will go to Poland or Romania. And very practically what the Russians want, what Russian state wants, is to really affect the German federal elections, really give a huge boost to AfD, which is a Russian tool, and to Le Pen in France. This is what they really want politically, geopolitically to achieve. How can we stop that? What can we actually do? Obviously put everything we have into Ukraine, and we are not doing it. I can talk for hours about it, but we are not doing it, unfortunately. Very practically, I think the mindset we have in Central Europe is that the question is, are we historically thinking in 1937 today, so right before a large global war, or are we in 1947, which is like before a global Cold War, the next one, but there will be localized regional conflicts such as the one in Ukraine now? And the question is, the difference is, if we will be able to really arm ourselves to the teeth as Central Europe to make sure that the Russians do not decide to really attack NATO, first. Second, if we will be able to really align with the US over China policy, so the next US president, whoever it is, will have a reason to deter the Russians from attacking eastern flank of NATO. And this is really the only question which at least military political leaderships in Central and Northern Europe are really thinking about. So kind of this dichotomy. Are we going to make it or not? Or are we going to face like the Russian attack in the next 3 to 5 years?
Thank you, Jakub. Thank you all. Lots of optimism. Thank you for the questions to the audience. I guess please join me in thanking our panelists. And please stay with us. There's another plenary coming up and lots of things, lots of good, hopefully more optimistic things for you. Thank you again.